The U.S. has presented a resolution to the UN Security Council where it had tried to get other members on board to approve an extension of the arms ban treaty against Iran. Now, the GCC countries of the Persian Gulf have agreed to this, but beyond that, it has failed to gain traction, especially with veto-wielding members like Russia and China, who have said to veto the bill. In this debate, we will look at why the U.S. is not even in a position to propose this sanctions bill and how the U.S. maximum pressure campaign against Iran has failed.
The United States is pressing ahead with its plan to extend an arms embargo against Iran, despite realities indicating that Washington's bid is almost a non-starter. In its latest effort, the U.S. has proposed a revised anti-Iran draft resolution in an apparent bid to garner support in the UN Security Council. The new text contains only 4 paragraphs on the issue until the Council decides otherwise. The previous text had more than a dozen pages and was aimed at indefinitely extending the arms embargo on Iran. In reaction, Iran said Washington would fail in its effort to extend the arms embargo.
The U.S. has put forward a resolution against this part of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 in a bid to violate the UN document. We are really hopeful that the U.S. will fail and once again suffer defeat and isolation.
Rouhani also said those pushing for the extension will be responsible for any possible consequences. He has stressed that Iran's military and defense capabilities pose no threat to neighboring countries. Rouhani was referring to a recent statement by the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council that called for the extension of the ban, a move slammed by Iran as irresponsible, unilateral, and dictated by others. Meanwhile, Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif said the U.S. itself is aware that the draft resolution will fail to pass through the 15-member council.
U.S. officials were working on a draft resolution for over 3 months. Ultimately, they came to the conclusion that the resolution would receive less than 5 votes in the Security Council, which would lead to U.S. isolation further. Therefore, the U.S. changed and simplified the previous version of the draft resolution. However, it will not win more votes.
The U.S. draft resolution has already faced widespread opposition, even among America's Western allies. UN Security Council diplomats say the simpler draft can help Washington win some new votes. However, they believe that it is unlikely to convince Russia and China to refrain from using their veto power. This is what UN Director at the International Crisis Group, Richard Gowan, tweeted. Recently, U.S. State Department's hawkish special envoy for Iran, Brian Hook, stepped down and was replaced by a special envoy for Venezuela, Elliot Abrams. Many assess that the move is another failure for Trump's administration. Observers believe that the U.S. potential breakdown is extending the arms embargo, which is due to expire in October under the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, is another sign of failure for Washington's so-called maximum pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, Frederick Peterson, a senior U.S. congressional defense advisor who joins us from Washington, D.C. We'd also like to welcome Syed Mohsin Abbas. He's a journalist and political commentator who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. Frederick Peterson, let me first start with you. Why does the U.S. want to extend an arms embargo against Iran in the first place?
Well, it's quite clear that this has been policy for some time of the United States under Democrat and Republican administrations in order to do 3 things. 1, to assist in creating a more stable Middle East where terror is not being exported, subsidized, and inflicted upon neighbors and throughout the world. 2, that the people of the Middle East, including the people of the states in question, treat their own citizens with respect and freedom as are reached for by the Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations. So, and number 3, to prevent the abuse of treaties and creation of weapons that would create mass destruction potentially or have undue influence upon neighbors within the neighborhood and throughout the world, in fact.
Okay, let me get a reaction from Syed Mohsin Abbas, since you have given those reasons, if you don't mind, Frederick Peterson. You've given 3 reasons there, and Syed Mohsin Abbas, you heard those reasons. some may scratch their head and say that, in a way, is describing the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. I was almost giggling, and I shouldn't on a really serious program, but I mean, honestly, the kind of the laughable argument that America in some way is doing all of this in terms of trying to create world security or peace is absolutely the biggest joke in the world. Let's get things straight. The US is the biggest terror agency on this planet. It has an industrial military arms complex which has spent between 5.6 trillion and 7 trillion since 2001 on its so-called war on terror. In fact, it's a war of terror on the people of the world. Over 40% of the countries of the world have now been inflicted this war of terror. The American taxpayer has been paying out something like $24,000. Some are saying per annum. There's for instance, there's a 32 million pounds per hour quote that I've had from the Institute for Policy Studies that the Americans have been churning out. So this $7 trillion on a war which has achieved nothing more than murdering civilian, killing children, murdering, maiming from Yemen to Iraq to Afghanistan through to even the likes of Libya. I mean, it's an endless litany of violence and terror inflicted by American weapons. So if anybody needs an arms embargo placed upon it, it is the American industrial military complex. And the US is... Sorry.
Let's have Frederick Peterson answer that. Do you think the U.S. is the one that should have an arms embargo placed on it?
First of all, I should like to say how I've been able to entertain your other guest here, and his humor is really reciprocated. I will tell you, to call the United States the creation of a terror threat within the world is quite funny. It is not actually funny. It is pathetic. The United States has stood for free peoples, not peoples. You will not see people in the United States, crowds chanting death to anybody, although you routinely do see that in other countries that are the agents and the fosterers of terrorism within the world. That is what we are trying to stop, deter, for the benefit of the people who are within those countries and for the consequences that are sent to their neighbors around them.
I'm going to jump in here because we're getting off track of what the topic of this program is. Because I can just tell you, well, why don't you take a look at some of the streets in the U.S. when you talk about how American flags are being burnt and chants against the U.S. establishment. However, let's stick to the topic. Can I ask you, Frederick Peterson, about the standing that the U.S. has when it wants to extend this arms embargo? Does it have a legal standing? I mean, after all, that's the question that everybody is asking, including the members of the Security Council, the ones that hold that veto power. They're saying, well, the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal, so it doesn't have a standing to try to extend this arms embargo.
Well, the nuclear deal was being grossly violated. The objective is to introduce weapons of mass destruction within a region that is free of them at this point. What we need to do is agree at a very base level that our objective, the United States and those with whom it is contending at this point, have a common objective, and that truthfully be peace within the region. And peace is not attained by oppression, by threats, by violence, by fostering terrorism either at home or abroad, by the sending out of murder agents. By the hundreds people have been assassinated. It hasn't been by the United States. The United States stands for and will be a good, loyal, dependable, and most beneficent partner in reaching for true peace. That's not what we have. The United Nations has a decision to make. Will they reach for their own principles of peace, or will they whistle, pretend, and walk away from the responsibility that they and their charter imposes upon them.
Syed
That's
Mohsin
the
Abbas, our
question.
guest there, sorry, let me address Syed Mohsin Abbas now. Our guest there talks about the U.S. and how it appears, based on his statements, that he's got a rallying support behind him. But when the U.S. presented this to the UN Security Council, you only had 5 countries that were for it. So it was forced to go back and give a watered-down version. That's plain old facts here. So what does that show, Syed Mohsin Abbas?
Well, it shows that the United States is out on a limb. Just about everything it's done since Donald Trump has certainly come into power has segregated it from any kind of sanity and world, if you like, common sense policies. I mean, they've pulled out of the Trans-Pacific trade agreement with the Chinese. They pulled out the Paris Agreement in terms of the climate side of things. They destabilize trade relations with even their own partners in Europe. They're trying to almost disband NATO by telling everybody to cough up, basically destabilizing their own security interests there. It's an absolutely maniac-like policy that they're operating. They're increasingly isolating themselves, making them the laughing stocks of the international diplomatic communities. But you've got a set of clowns who are being pushed by other very, very serious folk in the background, the think tanks that are forcing America to create a suicidal set of policies for itself, are doing it probably with an agenda to actually bring America down a peg or two, because the rise of China is seriously, obviously, making the Americans more than nervous, and that's also spilling over to policies, of course, with Russia and, most importantly, Iran. Now, you know, they basically had pulled out of the JCPOA. They're no longer part of it. They've tried to use this convoluted legal argument to say that they can do this snapback because they're still part of the JCPOA. Well, they walked out of the JCPOA unilaterally, and they haven't come back. They've not done anything to create the circumstances for them to be accepted back. The Europeans know that. All the other signatories, the Russians and the Chinese, know that. And the Russians and Chinese will block anything that happens, you know, in the UN regarding this issue anyway. But the actual, the Security Council itself is obviously throwing it out of the window, and they're just basically running around cap in hand, begging people to come on board with a nonsensical effort to try and eradicate Iran's, you know, natural right to self-defense.
Let me expand on that point and ask you, Frederick Peterson. I mean, things are so bad that Washington, based on what I'm looking at here, had to actually was hoping to persuade Estonia and Tunisia, and they're friendly to the U.S., to submit a compromise resolution. It couldn't even get them to do that. So why do you think the U.S. is not able to get that support?
We have come back to a very simple statement now, from several pages long, as your other guest, whose rendition of this is not comical. It's rather sad, actually. And we now have come up with a very simple statement. The question is, what will the world choose? We are confronted with, in fact, as so many questions ultimately are at their root, a moral choice of right and wrong. What do we stand for? Do we, in fact, have a common aspiration for freedom of peoples? And to select China as somehow being a hero, a newfound ally and hero of Iran, is most unfortunate to the degree that it is true. China is a threat to all of the things that the United Nations Statement of Principles stand for, that the United States stands for, that freedom-loving peoples throughout the world, in all areas of the world, should indeed stand for. China, who murders its people by that includes Christian, Muslim, and freedom sparklers, among their own by the tens of thousands, dying, harvesting organs in the most horrible way. And to contrast that, to hold that up as a potential ally against the United States that holds a lamp of liberty to the world and a promise for true working for higher ideals that we all in fact, whatever our differences should have in
okay,
common.
Got it. So
and
let me have say
the
Mohsin Abbas.
opportunity is there. We do the right thing or not.
Let me have say Mohsin Abbas address that. Actually, when it comes to harvesting of organs, we could talk about how Israel does that also, but that's another topic. So say Mohsin Abbas, our guest Frederick Peterson says we've reached a moment of truth. It sounds very similar to what Iran's foreign minister Zarif has said. Quote, the international community in general and the UN in particular are facing an important decision. Do we maintain respect for the rule of law, or do we return to the law of the jungle by surrendering to the whims of an outlaw bully? Reference to the U.S.
Well,
what do you think?
Jawad Zarif has nailed it, really, that the international community has to eventually, come out and stand up for those values that are constantly talked about in the UN but not delivered. And of course, if they follow the United States version of liberty, then you need to go and ask all of those nations where they've induced color revolutions, paid terrorists. Maybe they should also go and ask ISIS as to what their morals were and why the Americans and Hillary Clinton and co all were quite happy to support them in terrorizing the entire Middle East. That was totally done with the sanctioning of the US establishment. Those are the morals that we're talking about. The fact of the matter is that the primary purpose of this stopping of arms for Iran was essentially to bring Iranians to heel. This is what they've been desperately doing since 1979, and an unfortunate American policy which is really just following the Israeli requirements in that region to balkanize the Middle East. But what have they achieved? I mean, look, today, Mr. Hook this week has also thrown his hook. He's another one that's gone down from the Trump administration. That's an admission that the policy they had against Iran has failed. It's another blatant admission that the Pompeo line and the Trump line is not working. Iran hasn't gone down. Iran's sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions of America on Iran have made it more self-sufficient. It's diversified its industries. It's developed the mining sector, its agricultural sector, its technological sector. It's got a military which is now capable of putting satellites into aerospace. It has fired an American military camp in I think it was the Assad base in Iraq, after it was the Americans who violated international law by killing a diplomatic missionary into Iraq, Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani, and then claimed that it was entitled to do so. Basically, extrajudicial killings. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what American arms policy in that region is. It's basically terrorize the entire Middle East.
Let's find out what Frederick Peterson thinks. Frederick Peterson, the resignation of Brian Hook, has brought that conclusion by many that is the policy, that the U.S. maximum pressure policy just wasn't panning out. It's said that that's one of the reasons, not, of course, within the states maybe, but there are many political analysts that have concluded that. Which side are you on? Do you think he resigned because of that or other reasons?
Let me say this, and let me ask your other guests to comment on this. Can we agree, let us find a common ground, can we agree that peace, prosperity, and liberty are objectives that we share in common, in fact, in truth, in our hearts and in our actions? If we can agree on that, truly, without manipulating words, contorting sentences in order to make them appear something they aren't. If we can agree on those principles, truthfully, we can look at who has an attempt to influence governments on all sides to act and refrain from acting according to those principles. Now, we have a very grave threat of international warfare which will trample upon those three principles, will utterly destroy prosperity, which is, as we can see, is already being destroyed by other means. It will eliminate peace from the region again, and liberty will be no more, because there will be vast areas of that. let us find common agreement. That agreement is written within charters of the UN, but too often they are mere words floating like feathers in a breeze.
Let me get a reaction then from Syed Mohsin Abbas. I'm sorry, Frederick Peterson.
Put on the bird so that bird can fly. Yes,
Syed
sir.
Mohsin Abbas, our guest mentions peace, prosperity, and liberty, and yet just days ago, the UN, a series of UN specialists came out and said that sanctions are killing people. And they specifically mentioned the U.S. and the sanctions that have been exerted, especially in the landscape of COVID-19. So how does that fit in with your notion of peace, prosperity, and liberty? Syed Mohsin Abbas.
It fits in on no level at all. You know, the moral bankruptcy of the United States administration, successive administrations, is there for anybody who wants to go and see the evidence. Basically, they have economically terrorized Iran. They've got no moral economics whatsoever, as far as I'm concerned. They've raped that region of oil which didn't belong to them. They've saturated the area with dissident terrorist groups at every level, whether it's Al-Jundalos who attacks Iran, or the MEK or the MKO that attacks Iran, all funded by the Americans. That's just a tip of the iceberg. The ISIS, the Al-Qaedas, I won't even go there, you know, in terms of the other forces, they proxy forces they finance. The war against Iran for 8 years, which inflicted millions of deaths on the Iranian people, is not forgotten by anybody who has any understanding of geopolitics in that region. Again, Americans behind that entire Saddam operation. So look, the litany of American immorality, if I go into that, I'm afraid we need a series of maybe 500 programs to be able to list them in total.
I'll tell the producer about that.
Sorry?
I'll tell the producers about that. Maybe we should do something like that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end the debate. We're just fresh out of time. Thank you for that, Syed Mohsin Abbas, journalist and political commentator from London. Frederick Peterson, I wish we had more time, but thank you. Senior U.S. Congressional Defense Advisor from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.